Hello everyone, welcome to the chatbot discussion. In the previous recording, we have seen how we can deploy our model as a web service using Flask. Right? We built a model where we have loaded the encoder, decoder, and we also loaded the tokenizers. We have defined our own prediction function, right? And then we have imported that model as a package, basically just saving that model, saving the Jupyter notebook as a Python file. We imported that model as a package, right? And then we have used Flask to associate a web service URL to that, right? So this is the URL that we have seen. 5000 is the port number, 127.0.0.1 is the IP address. But towards the end of the last recording, I have posed a question. Is this the URL that we really want to access? Before that, where do we mention? How are we going to access it, right? That is where we are going to build a chatbot, and we're going to use this popular collaboration app called Slack, right? So just first let us understand how this communication through chat actually happens. So we have a chat window, maybe people who have used computers during the late 1990s, you guys might be aware of MIRC32, right? Chat room where people used to speak with people outside, not just their street, not just their state, right? Outside country. We have people speaking with people in like Europe, Pakistan, Malaysia, right? And people were getting excited at that point of time, right? So what is the technology that is used for chat, right? You have chat window. That is how the communication happens. That is interface. The chat window is interface through which user one, located maybe in a different geographical location altogether, chats with a person who is located in a completely different geographical location. Right? The chat window is that interface through which communication happens. Right? Now, why is this important to our course? Why are we looking at chat? This user knows only English, and this user knows only Hindi. Right? Now, whatever this user is typing, right, this guy can only interpret in Hindi. So you are looking at sequence to sequence translations, right? This English language translation to Hindi language. That's the reason why we are looking at this particular use case of deploying chatbots. Right? So some key things to think about. How do we know someone is online? Right? Again, that interface is happening. The interface chat window is being used to track whether somebody is online or whether somebody is not online. How my message gets sent to a specific person, we need to mention the sender, right? We need to mention the receiver, right? When you are the sender. How does someone reply back to me, right? How do you think the reply is coming from? There is a server that is moderating all this information, right? You are a client, your chat window is your client, you're submitting a request, and that request from the client is sent to the server, and the server processes that request and sends you back the response. In our case, we're going to send from the chat window English language as input, and you're going to get the output as Hindi translation. Right? The server is going to make that translation. What is the server in our case? The web server that we have just started, Flask service, right? That our model, it has been started as a web service, right? That's the server that we are now. I'm practically running a server on my laptop, right? So web server, which is running at port number 5000. Right? So generally, role of a group chat server is that you have a user, right? His authentication is done, registration. First he registers, and then he authenticates, and then this chat server, right? It extracts information from the database, and it will help in dissemination of information that one user is typing, one user is posting with other users in the network. Right? So this is how a group chat server is set up. And this is how the communication through chat happens. Both the chat windows, right? They deal with the chat messaging server. This is where our Flask web server comes into picture. Right? So user one, English, right? And user two is nothing but the server making that translation to Hindi and sending you the translated text. Right? So this is where we add a chatbot. We add a chatbot server, right, that makes this translation. So how do we do that? We'll see, right? We use something called Slack, right? Slack contains this entire setup, right? Slack, it's easy to go and register up for Slack, right? Let me open up in my incognito window, slack.com, right? Go to Slack, and then you just enter your email address, right? So I'm going to use my email address, right? Get started, right? And then it will ask you to create a new workspace. You can create your own workspace, right? You'll get some email code, right? I've already created a workspace. Let me show you what that workspace is. So this is how I created a workspace called Apex, right? I logged in with my Apex email ID, and I created, once you go to Workspace, right, you can create multiple channels, right? General, random, translation, right? These are different channels that I created. General and random will be there by default, and I created this translation channel. The channel is nothing but, say for example, you logged in, right, and you have different groups in your organization. Maybe a group consisting of all your team members, a group consisting of all your managers, a group consisting of all the non-tech people, like people from support or other event committees that you're part of, right? So you'll have 3 different channels, like 3 different WhatsApp groups. That's what it is. And this is your space, right? So that it is easy. It's fairly easy to do that. These are the steps. Register on Slack, learn about teams, channels, and you create your team workspace. As I said, right, you can create a channel for your team, for your managers, or for your friends at work who are not part of your team, right? And this is how you add a chatbot to your Slack team channel, right? So now I created a workspace, right, which is Apex, right? Now I'm creating a Slack app, right? That is nothing but a chatbot, right? So you create a Slack app by going to api.slack.com Slack apps, right? If I go there, right, this is the command, api.slack.com apps, right? And then I have my own apps, right? If I click on your apps, right? So I created an app called Translation, and it's easy to create a new app, right? To create an app, let us say English to Hindi, right? Translation, right? And I'll just say Apex, right? This is the workspace. This is a workspace that I've already created when I first logged in, right? Apex is the workspace that I've already created, right? And I just, once you created your workspace, once you create your team workspace, you come to this URL and you create an app, right? I'm creating an app. Now app will take some time to get created, right? Once I create that app, right, this is the app that I'm going to use as chatbot, right? I'm going to use something called / command, right? If I click on / command, I mean, again, all this documentation is available, right? I have chosen Slack primarily because there is so much documentation available about Slack, right? Once you go to / commands, create new command, and I'm giving a command something like to Hindi, right? And this is where I need to give the URL, right? Now, what is the URL on which my model is running? 127.0.0.1, right? Should I give this HTTP 5000? Will it work? Because Slack is an external application, right? These IP address 127.0.0.1 will always refer to the local host, right? But my machine is defined behind a firewall, right? I need to provide a URL, right? A public URL, because this is a private URL, 127.0.1, right? There is no way Slack can directly refer my laptop by using this, because this is just my private address, right? I need to give a public address to Slack, right? That's the reason why we use something called Ngrok, right? We are building a server locally. So Ngrok is a package. You download Ngrok and then you just extract the files and you start ngrok, right? So how do I do that? Go to ngrok, just download for Windows, right? It will download a zip file. Let me also show you the zip file. Ngrok, right? This is the zip file that I got, right? Now what you just need to extract it, unzip it, right? Unzip in a particular path, then you go to that path, right? Once you also, here you can also look at signing in, installation. When you sign in, you need to sign in, right? Once you sign in, you get a token here, authentication token, right? So what you need to do, you need to copy that token. Right? Again, this is a one-time activity, so it should not take much time for you. Right? Once you copy that token, right, you go to the ngrok prompt, right? Ngrok, you just start ngrok application. This is ngrok application, right? Once ngrok application is activated, command line prompt, right? And then you give the command in this particular format, right? Ngrok in the command line, right? Once it is installed, once you click on, so this is how you do this. Click on ngrok application on your desktop. Once the files are unzipped, right? In the command prompt that pops up, right? You type ngrok right, as you can see here. Ngrok auth token, right? Ngrok auth token. This is the first, it's a one-time activity by the auth token, this, right? You type enter, right? So what happens now? Now your authentication is done. There'll be a web service URL, right? It's a public IP. That's what you're getting. Your public IP address you're getting, right? A public IP address will be assigned to your account, right? And then what you need to do, you need to map that public IP address to the web service, right? So what you need to do, public ngrok HTTP, because it's a web server, right? You give the port number, right? So the documentation is 80, but in our case, what is our port number? 5000, right? Because you need to map this web service that is running here to the public IP address, right? The model which is running as web service, that you want to map to your public IP, right? So that's the way you say ngrok HTTP 5000, right? And then you'll get a URL like this, right? So you'll get a pop-up like this. Once you do that, this is how you're going to get, right? And this is the URL that you take, right? HTTP 2821 B2 B8 C, right? I'm just copying this, right? And this is the IP address that you give here. Right? English to Hindi is the command. This request URL, and you need to give a short description, something like translates text from English to Hindi, right? And then you click on save, right? You click on save, and then you go to your apps, right? So both English to Hindi and translation are present, right? And then you go to your Steam workspace, right? So let me just refresh this. Right? And then I click on apps, right? So, and then currently I have translation app, and this is another app that I created, right? So I need to install that app. What is the name of that app? English to Hindi translation, right? So let me just do English. English to Hindi translation, right? So let me get English. Okay, so I think there is some problem with that. Let me just add this to my workspace. Install your app to your workspace, right? So I need to click on this. Install app to workspace. right? It asks me to authorize. And once I authorize, because I created an app, now it's a created chatbot app, right? So now this app will be available in my workspace, right? So now if I click on this, if I click on refresh, right? So as you can see, right now the English to Hindi translation app is also present here, right? Now I have the app. Now, what is the trigger word? The trigger word, trigger command to get the translation is this, slash, what was the slash command that we're given here? Slash command, English to Hindi, right? So now all I need to do is slash English to Hindi, right? What is the text that I'm going to, let me say, how are you, right? I'm just mentioning, so this is how I'm triggering. So the moment I press enter, now a request is going to be made to this URL. The request will be sent to this public URL, right? And this public URL is in turn mapped to this URL, web service, right? Localhost, right? Now that text is going to be passed to this decode sentence function. And what is decode sentence function? Decode sentence function is nothing but this, right? It's going to predict, right? What is it going to predict? It is going to convert how are you, the English text, to Hindi text, right? Let us see if this is indeed what happens. I pressed enter. As you can see, right, I'm getting the output from the web service that I use for the model. Hi Sai Charan Tej, here is the Hindi translation of your input. Aap kaise hai? Because that's exactly how I mentioned the text, right? Hi Sai Charan Tej, right? And comma Hindi translation aap kaise hai? Whenever I see this text in this particular manner, right? What if I type something that is not there, that is not learned by the model, something like zebra, right? Slash English to Hindi zebra. In that case, right, it still gave me some random output, right? So let me just give my name. Right? It just by randomly it is giving this particular word, va, right? But in real world, you might be typing some words, right? Something like this, English to Hindi. Why is Slack so popular? It is not part of vocabulary, right? Your input sentences is not part of the input sentences. What if I give something like this, right? So it gives us some random text, random output, or in sometimes it might say that I don't understand it, right? So that's the reason why we have catching them, try and accept, right? It will give you something like I did not understand your sentence, right? Let me push it, right? It's randomly giving me some output, right? That means it is able to identify these words. Why is popular, because they're also part of the vocabulary, right? Something like, let us give this sentence, Slack needs your permission, right? So it is still coming some permission, some issues, but generally whenever there are sentences that it cannot understand, it will give this message, sorry, I did not understand your sentence, right? You can also train the model, right, to come up with a generic error message. How? With the input text, right, you give something like unknown, you map it to unknown, right? Something like UNK, right? You train the model saying that whenever you are receiving words that you're unable to make sense of, right, you decode it into something in Hindi translation. Instead of saying, sorry, I did not understand your sentence, something like, my samajh nahi raha, right? Something like that. Right? Sentence mujhko samajh nahi aa raha, right? Something like that. Right? You can also train the model in such a way that whenever these kind of junk words are getting passed, whenever you're seeing words that are not part of your input vocabulary, right? Not part of the training model, at that point of time, you can come up with customized error messages. Right? So this is how we built a chatbot. We used, so what we did, so let me just summarize what we have done so far, right? First, we built encoders and decoders, right? While predicting Hindi text from English input, right? Then we loaded these encoders, decoders, tokenizers, right? And generated padded sequences, right? In a module, in a Python module, right? This module also contains the prediction function, also contains the prediction, which is nothing but decode function, decode underscore sentence function, right? Then what I did, I saved the Jupyter, I saved this as a module, right? And then I loaded this module, right? Which in turn loaded the model, right? Which loaded the model corresponding to step 2. Step 2, right? And then I used Flask to associate a web service to this model, right? Then what I did, I went to Slack, right? In Slack, I created a team space, right? And then I went to the Slack app API link, and I created a Slack app, English to Hindi translation, right? But to communicate with my model, the app needed a public URL, right? So I downloaded ngrok software to map a public URL to the web service, to the Flask web service that I started in step 5, right? Now in the app configuration, I've given the public URL, I've given the forwarding URL, which is nothing but public URL details, right? Then I came to Slack team space, right? In Slack team space, I called the model, in the slash command, right? It's in the slash command, because slash command will be used to trigger the communication between Slack and your model, between Slack and your web service, right? In the Slack team space, I call the model using the slash command. What is the slash command? The slash command is English to, what is the Slack command? English to Hindi, right? English to Hindi is the Slack command, slash command. You can define your own slash command. Okay, there is no syntax part. Slash command, and it returned the Hindi text to me, right? In a nutshell, this is what we have done. We built encoders, decoders. We've done this in the previous recordings. Now, in the previous recording, right, when we were talking about saving the TensorFlow model and loading the models that we have saved, we loaded the encoders, decoders, tokenizers, generated parent sequences in a Python module. This module also contains the function. We saved this as a module. We downloaded it as a Python file, the notebook, and we saved that as a module, right? That is what we are looking at here. Yeah, that is what we're looking at here. We imported that as model, right? And then we loaded this module, which loaded the module corresponding to step 2. That is what this is. This is the first step, right? We imported the model and then used Flask to create a web service to this model. And then I went to Slack. I created Teamspace. I went to Slack app API link, created Slack app, English to Hindi translation. To communicate with the model, I need to use a slash command, and the slash command needed a public URL. So that's the reason why I downloaded ngrok software to map a public URL to the Flask web service that I started in step 5. In the slash command, I've given the forwarded URL, public URL details, right? And then I went to the Slack Teamspace, and then I called the model using slash English to Hindi, and I gave whatever English sentence, and it returned me output. Right? If I do who is that, again, the model is not that trained, but I will recommend you guys to train the model much. I just ran it with 50 epochs. That's it. Right? Maybe you can try 100, 150 epochs, at which point of time the accuracy will be even better. It was accurate with the first sentence because these are fairly common. How are you? Well, 3 simple words. That's when it was really accurate with this particular translation. Okay, now I would recommend you guys to go through this presentation, right? Start creating your own models, right? Start creating your own Flask web service for even the character RNN model that we discussed for DaVinci Code, right? Predicting the next character. Steps are simple, right? There are multiple sources, one source where you can get the question answer data set. JMcCall is a famous data set source from where you can get the data, right? You can prepare the data, build the model, predict, integrate with the bot server, just like how we have done, and make the prediction. Right? So that's what I would recommend you guys to do. Do it for the DaVinci Code prediction that we have built. Same way, same logic. Right? You can just predict the next word whenever you pass the input. Right? That's the chatbot. Right? That's exactly what chatbot is. Right? Once you give a question, you need to predict the answer to that question. Talking about question answer prediction, right? Whatever we have seen so far, you are just directly converting whatever that is an input text into output text, right? One-to-one mapping, isn't it? But in real world, is mapping always going to be that way, right? Are you always going to build models, right, that are going to just take whatever that is input and give a output pertaining to those inputs? Not really. Right? Something like you take a set of 20 sentences and you want to reason the logic behind those 20 sentences, right? You will not be able to give answers that are there in the questions itself, right? Not every answer is always going to be there in the question, right? You might have to deduce answers, deduct, infer answers, right? How do we deal with those kind of scenarios? That's what we're going to discuss in the next recording. Right, that is the final concept that we're going to discuss as part of our deep learning recordings, right? And that's exactly what we're going to see in the next recording. Right? How do we? So far, what we have seen is machines learning from the input text, right, and generating output text. In the next recording, we are going to look at machines not just learning, right? Machines actually thinking, deducing, analyzing, reasoning. That's what we're going to see in the next recording. So have fun with the chatbots, creation of chatbots. It's actually fun, right? Because so far we've seen everything in the context of Jupyter Notebook, which might give you a research feel, but now you're seeing the actual practical implications of it, right? How you can make your models available to others, right? Available to other apps. How you can use Slack app to interact with your model. Right? On that note, this is Sai signing off.